Good afternoon, good morning for our West Coast friends, good evening for those around the world. I'm Hadar Susskind, the president and CEO of New Jewish Narrative. I will be moderator for today's webinar. Thank you all so much for joining us. In just a moment, I will introduce all of my esteemed colleagues who will be our speakers today, and we'll dig in, but I'm going to participate in the time-honored Washington tradition of filibustering for a minute as we wait for the Zoom room to fill. So while we are doing that, again, I welcome you. I say hello. A little bit of housekeeping. I remind everyone this webinar will be recorded and shared out, so you'll be able to share it with friends, families, and colleagues who weren't able to be here today. We do want to hear from you and take questions from as many people as possible. I urge you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen for that, not the chat, not hand raising, not anything else. If you want to get a question in, please post it in the Q&A, and we will get to as many of those as we possibly can. As always, please keep it focused on the topic. As you know, we are here today to discuss a very serious and very intense topic. So while there are always other things to cover and always other things that are relevant, let's try and keep it focused there. So again, hello, welcome. I'm Hadar Susskind from New Jewish Narrative. Thank you all for joining us here today. Thank you for my colleagues for being here. I will briefly, before actually I hit our speakers today, want to thank our co-sponsoring organizations that include Aleph, L'Chaim, Jews Against the Death Penalty, the New Jewish Narrative, New Israel Fund, J Street, Trua, Partners for Progressive Israel, Rabbis for Human Rights, Reconstruction Judaism, and Small Emoni USA. So thank you to all the organizations for co-sponsoring this event, and thank you to everybody from around the world who's joining us. With that, I want to go ahead and introduce my colleagues who will be speaking today. First will be Benzi Sykora. Benzi is the policy director at the Israeli think tank Zulat. Zulat, in case any of you are not familiar, is a relatively new think tank founded and headed by former Meretz head Zahava Galon. And they focus on protecting human rights, fighting all forms of exclusion and discrimination, and steering Israel toward democracy, freedom, and equality, all things which we could use a great deal more of. I'm also pleased to be joined by Shira Ben Sasson-Furstenberg, who is the Israel director for the New Israel Fund, and of course, Rabbi Jill Jacobs, the CEO of Trua, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights. So we are here today to talk about the death penalty bill that is being considered in Israel right now. That's maybe the first time that I've referred to it without calling it the hideous racist death penalty bill that is being considered in Israel right now, because it really is both of those things. And we're going to dig in. We're going to learn more about it. We're going to start off in just a moment by hearing from Benzi, who's going to walk us through the details of the bill, the content, what's happening, and what's going on in the political process. And then we will hear from Shira and then Jill as we expand from that point and really think about, what is the fact that this is happening now telling us about Israeli political reality, about Israeli society, and then how are we as Jews in the United States engaging around this, reflecting on this as well. So with that, I am going to stop rambling and I'm going to say, Benzi, please come on in, unmute, join us, and let's start with the fundamentals. Walk us through what this bill actually says. What's in here?
Yeah, will do. First of all, I just want to start real quick and say thank you to all of you for organizing this and for joining us. It's been a rough few years here in Israel. It's been pretty bleak, and I know that this government also doesn't make it easy for you guys to stay engaged. And so the fact that you still are, it means a lot. So I just want to start with that and say thank you. All right, so 30 seconds of history on the bill. Israel technically has a death penalty, right? But it's very, very narrow. It's specifically for Nazis. Eichmann is the only time it's ever been used. So that's what exists for now. Technically, we also have a death penalty in the military courts in the West Bank under very specific conditions, but in practice, that doesn't actually happen. partly because of the international repercussions of using it, which is something that we used to care about, and partially because the security establishment historically has viewed it as counterproductive and maybe even dangerous. So that exists, but it's not used. With that said, the idea of expanding the death penalty to apply it to terrorists has been kicking around on the populist far right for years, at least a decade. I think Lieberman was the first one who introduced legislation in 2015, if I'm not mistaken, and then Ben-Gvir, when he came into our lives, basically made it central to his entire political identity. But these bills were always more like for to grab headlines as opposed to serious attempts at legislation. That changed with everything else after October 7th, I think. All of a sudden, there was a political window, right? A traumatized society, much less sympathy towards Palestinians, and even more so when it came to Palestinian terrorists. The opposition was terrified of being labeled, soft on terror. So all of a sudden, it created this political opportunity, and they seized it, and they started pushing for the legislation for real this time. So the way the bill is structured is it's in two parts. Lieberman is behind one of the bills, Lieberman's party, and the other, and Ben-Gvir's party, and they took two bills and they sort of mashed them together in the committee. And it's built in two parts. One for within Israel's borders proper, and the other for the West Bank. And if we zoom out for just a second, that's significant in and of itself, because that means that it's sort of Lieberman, Avigdor Lieberman is the head of Israel Beitenu party. It's a far-right secular party, used to sit in Bibi's coalition with him. Then they kind of had a personal falling out, so he's part of the opposition with us technically, but in practice, he's very much on the right. And Ben-Gvir, I'm sure most of you are familiar with him. He's a Jewish supremacist fascist. So the bill itself. So as I was saying, because it legislates both within Israel itself and the West Bank. There's an annexationist element to it. That's something we should be aware of, because the Knesset is not supposed to legislate within the West Bank because it's technically a temporary occupation, right? Formally, what the bill does is it tells the military commander, to amend the military orders there, but that's honestly just legislation with extra steps. So that's something and it's something that the government's flirted with doing before, but never this directly and never on an issue this dramatic. So something to keep in mind, separate from the bill itself. The bill is structured in that, as I was saying, it separates into Israel and the West Bank. So in Israel, the way it works is that it adds an option for the death penalty. It adds it to the toolbox of a prosecutor when there's murder that's been committed by somebody who's been deemed a terrorist. Originally, it was supposed to be a mandatory death penalty, and it was worded in a way that it would only apply to Arabs. I think the direct quote was, anyone who acts with the aim of harming the state of Israel and the resurrection of the Jewish people in the land. So that's very obvious what that's aiming for. The legal advisor to the committee was like, you can't do that. So eventually they had to soften that language a little bit. And so now it's not mandatory within Israel, but it becomes an option on the table. But what it still remains in the bill, even after they so-called softened it, is that it still it doesn't distinguish between perpetrators, but it does distinguish between the victims, because the death penalty would only apply when the act is committed with the purpose of harming a citizen or resident of Israel. So that does capture both Palestinian citizens of Israel and Jews, but it does not capture Palestinians in the West Bank. So the death penalty would not apply if a terrorist attacks Palestinians. They did a lot of work within the committee. I sat in all these committee meetings, and they did every possible thing they could do to try to make it apply to as many Arabs as possible and to as few Jews. This is the best that they could come up with. So that's within Israel proper. And then the second half, as we were saying, is within the West Bank. And as usual, with the West Bank, it's worse there. What they did is the wording there says that it would apply to anyone, to any terrorist attack who resides in the West Bank, except a resident of an Israeli settlement in the area. So technically, I guess that's geographic, but it's really not subtle, right? It's differentiating Jews and Arabs within the West Bank very blatantly. Additionally, what it does in the West Bank is it will be a mandatory death penalty for anyone who's accused of murder via terror. Which, as far as I'm aware, does not exist in mandatory death penalty. I don't think exists in any other democracy in the world. It would no longer require a unanimous decision by the judges on the court, which also means theoretically you could have a judge saying that he's innocent, a minority opinion saying the person is innocent, and still get the death penalty, which is bonkers to me. It bars clemency and commutation. It takes that out of the equation, which I'm not a legal expert, but I think that's somebody could correct me, but I think that's in direct violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. And it requires the sentence to be carried out within 90 days of the judgment, which, familiar with like Project Innocence and things like that, we know that a lot of the times people are cleared eventually when more details come to light, and so that wouldn't give time for that either. So just really, really, really not great. My position, Zulat's position, is that the death penalty is categorically wrong. And we reject it in any shape or form. Also, just legislating the death penalty as deterrence against terrorists who assume they're going to die anyway is just dumb policy. But even if you put all this aside and you think that there is some kind of argument to be made for it, I think this specific version of the legislation is just absolutely undefensible because, again, it blatantly differentiates on ethnic grounds. It would apply a mandatory death penalty for Palestinian terrorists and not for Jewish ones. And to be clear, obviously, I don't want Jewish terrorists put to death either, but differentiating between the two is just straight up Kahanism, right? It's Jewish supremacy. When we do lobbying work in the Knesset, so like now zooming into where we're at in the Knesset, when we do lobbying work, there's always a question, especially with this current coalition and government and political climate, there's always a question of whether we try to work with the coalition to try to soften the bill or whether we just go scorched earth. Here, there was no such debate. It was pretty clear to us from the beginning that we had to go all in and aggressively as possible against this, even if it meant burning bridges. This is the policy paper that we submitted to all 120 MKs. It's not subtle. We've coined the frame there, death penalty for Arabs bill. We sort of put that framing. So we also, and when we're in the committee, we're there all the time, and we, say pretty straightforward that, the only places we've seen this in history are very, very, very dark regimes. That's a lot of times that's when we get thrown out of the committee. They don't love it, but we just get kind of all in on that.
Benzi, let me ask you just to touch two things quickly here.
Yeah.
One is, can you share with everybody sort of where this is in the legislative process?
Yeah.
And along with that process, I know, you emailed me and others just on Sunday saying actually that, the prime minister has requested the bill be amended. So what does that mean that he's decided to weigh in, and what might that mean for the, for what's going to happen with this going forward?
Absolutely. So the current status of the bill is that they've been sprinting through it for weeks. Committee meetings almost every day. They're at the 5-yard line. They've finished all the wording of it. They're ready to vote on it. The opposition has submitted 1,200 or so amendments, and that's a pause. So they're voting through all of those amendments and striking them down now. That's a positive in itself because this was a bill that was very hard to get the opposition on board with a few notable exceptions, Gilad Kariv and Aida Tuma Suleiman. For those who are familiar, they've been there every day, but it's been very hard, especially the centrist parties, to get them on board on this bill. We work with them a lot of time and other things, and there's a lot of great cooperation, but here... Just to be clear,
when you say it's hard to get them on board, you mean opposing the bill, just so everyone understands.
Exactly. Or even they oppose the bill. We know they oppose the bill from the conversations that we have with them, but it's hard to get them to say it publicly and show up in the committee and fight for it because the politics are a little bit toxic right now for them, to be fair. And so they're trying to maneuver there and not with the politics what they are, and trying not to get hit on it too hard. So the fact that they showed up and submitted amendments and showed up in the committee over the last few days and voiced their opposition is a significant positive step. And we're working very hard to make sure that they object on the final vote if and when it comes to that on the Knesset plenum as well. Maybe this is a good time to say that if anybody has any contacts or communication with those parties, especially the centrist parties, might not be the worst thing in the world to push them in that direction. Yeah, another silver lining I'll also just say is that there's been a lot of very, very good collaboration within civil society in Israel. So Zulat, New Israel Fund, we work very closely together. There's a whole bunch of other organizations. We've sort of filled that vacuum within the committee. So there's a lot of us there all the time. But yeah, the bill is right now, they're voting through all of these amendments. Timeline is probably within a week or so. They'll probably finish and they'll be ready to bring it to the floor. But like, as you mentioned, all of a sudden, the last few days out of the blue, there were reports coming out that Netanyahu talked to Ben Gvir and essentially demanded that they soften the bill. The quote that came out was that Israel can't have a more hardline capital punishment than what the U.S. has. And this came after a lot of international pressure from embassies and from organizations and from Jewish community, presumably as well. So there's something, again, that's also, I think, something that we can take heart in a little bit, is that, the pressure can work here. And it's already having an effect. What Netanyahu is demanding of Ben Gvir is to remove the mandatory penalty aspect of it and to allow clemency and to eliminate the requirement that the victims be Israeli citizens or residents. which theoretically could also open it up to being applicable to Jewish terrorists as well. We know from what Ben Gvir has said in the past that he has no interest in stopping the bill at all. He said that he won't. So we're in this sort of a game of chicken, and we're waiting to see who blinks first. And that's going to affect also if and when the bill comes to a vote as well. So we're at the 5-yard line. It's close, but there's still hope, I think, and there's still some things we can do to slow it down and maybe even stop it. And I think I'll wrap up there.
Great. Thank you very much, Benzi. That's actually, that's a great segue for us to go to Shira, who again is the Israel director for New Israel Fund. Shira, obviously NIF and so many of your grantees and partners have been involved in this fight and so many others around it. So, let's step back a bit and say, Benzi said we might see this bill brought to the floor and perhaps pass in a week or two. But even if it does pass the Knesset, right, we know this fight isn't over. So talk to us a little bit, help us understand how civil society organizations, are fighting this and take this specific narrow fight also to the bigger, picture around issues of equality and justice in Israel.
Thank you, Hadar. Thank you, everyone. It's a heavy conversation to have, but it's good to have this conversation with people, with like-minded people and people who are aware of the meaning of these steps and the meaning of the language in this legislation and the language in the conversations. Just merely hearing them as an option is devastating. And I think what gives me strength is seeing people like Benzi. We're on as Israelis, we're on the same WhatsApp groups where everything gets done, and everything gets done. And Benzi and other friends from leading human rights organizations are on the ground, and in this case, on the ground means in the Knesset, day in, day out, sharing data, making sure that there's someone in the room at all times. And this is really what I wanted to open with and say, we are fighting in so many fronts in the area of the anti-democratic legislation and this death penalty for Arabs, or death penalty in general legislation, is just one in this big package of the democratic backsliding that we're experiencing in Israel and is not foreign to you wherever you are in the US at the moment. I think the differences may have to do with how our legislative systems work and different contexts and different scale, but similarities are just in our face every day. So this is not a theoretical conversation for any of us. But really, I take much strength in seeing the way civil society organizes and has been organizing for actually 3 years nonstop to respond to this judicial coup that doesn't happen, one day with one action that is comprehensive and changes our life in an instant, but it's the frog that's gradually in the heating water and gradually boiling. And every time there's a new piece of legislation and new guidelines and a new idea and something that the government is doing that accumulates into this situation and reality of democratic backsliding. And as always, as we know, familiar to us in these past decades, it starts with Palestinians in the West Bank. It moves to Palestinians within the Israeli borders, and it will touch on the Jews at the end. So if not for moral reasons of why to stand against all of these pieces of horrific legislation, Jews in Israel should just be concerned that if they tolerate this, then they're next. Of course, not the way I think about it, but if it's helpful for someone or it could influence someone, that's something to consider. I think what we really want you to know, people who took the time to join this call, I assume, are concerned about this. And I think what you should know is that we are organized, we are strategizing, we're being very, very smart and utilizing everything in our power, and we're doing it together. Benzi referred to it, and it is just the truth. We decide together what to do on our own. We plan, we strategize, we make sure that we have all bases covered, and we choose who speaks to which MKs, who speaks to which parties, who works with which media outlets, who is in touch with embassies when it pertains to foreign countries. We really divide and make sure that we are strategic about the way we approach all of these pieces of legislation. We do strategies together on how to make sure that there is public awareness and who does the campaigns on which of the social networks and the traditional media. And we see the work on the death penalty as I said before, in the general context of democratic backsliding, part of our work on freedom of expression, freedom of protest, the way civil society is being impacted, the way our free media is being impacted, you know, and it's not something that is a standalone piece. Now, I want to say that in this specific legislation, we see democratic backsliding coming to play, not just in the core of the meaning of this legislation, but also in the way that our security entities in Israel have been referring to this legislation, because for a long time, the ones who were really against the law was the Shin Bet, was our general, what do you call the Shin Bet in English?
Oh, the security services.
Yeah, the Israeli Security Service, the famous Israeli Security Service. And they were against this law because they understand that the meaning of a death penalty is far beyond the piece of paper that it's written on and what it could do in the conflict, in a context of a conflict, a bloody conflict. And now with the new leadership of our Shin Bet in Israel, this is where the democratic backsliding comes to play. This is where they're off guard, or their new guard, or whatever, the English language would say about this, is determining a new set of opinions and a new set of recommendations. And I still take pride in the fact that the Medical Association, the Israeli Medical Association, came out with a clear outline response and said, no doctors. And I don't want to get into the details of how the death penalty is carried, but we can all understand and have been around. No doctors will aid in any way, direct or indirect, to make this a reality. And when our security services are changing their position, our doctors are still in the right moral place. I think that has a lot to do with the way civil society is amplifying the meaning of everything that's happening in the Knesset, and making sure that all Israelis notice what is happening. I know you're working like crazy, Benzi.
I got a question for you, coming from what you were just saying about how civil society is amplifying this. First of all, actually, before the question, I just want to say thank you, actually, to you and NIF and Benzi and Zulat and all of the partners who are working on this, and who, particularly because it is such a difficult issue politically there. So I guess the question is, certainly my hope is this bill doesn't see the light of day. It gets squashed in internal disagreements. I would be thrilled if it got voted down, but I think there's a reasonably fair chance it's going to pass. And so I guess my question for you, I mean, again, I'd be really happy to be wrong, but I think it's at least an option that it's going to pass. So my question for you is, what happens? What do you and your coalition do the day after that if it does pass?
So the use of the term coalition is sometimes, confusing. When you say coalition, Hadar, I assume you mean the coalition of the civil society, human rights organizations who have their finger in the dam, and not the coalition who is rah-rah and interested in, everything that's in this bill. But I'm just
the good guys.
Yeah, the good coalition. So listen, the good coalition is there to make sure that this bill doesn't pass. and really working very strategically and diligently. But if it does pass, you will not be surprised to learn that the petitions have been written already. That I have checked with Noah Satat, the director of ACRI, the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, before our call to make sure that really the petitions are almost fully written and are in place and are prepared for different scenarios of different language of the legislation, even if it's softened and not that we support any kind of softened version. They are prepared with other legal organizations to take this to the Supreme Court. But let us notice something. Going to the Supreme Court is another step in jeopardizing our fragile democracy. And why is that? Because the Supreme Court of Israel, the High Court of Justice, is constantly asked to rule on the hottest burning potatoes in Israeli society. And all of the most challenging questions that tear Israeli society from within can't be decided by the Knesset, although they have the best majority they could have ever had. And for some reason, for close to 4 years already, they have a full-on right-wing government, but every time they have to rule on a law that we find appalling, and they know that many Israelis disagree with and have been promising to legislate, for some reason, all of the pieces of their judicial coup have mostly not been legislated, and they much rather weaken the Supreme Court by asking the Supreme Court to rule on the most divisive issues in Israeli society. And so my answer to you, Hadar, is yes, there is work on the way to make sure that we have the second stage of post-legislation, although hoping it doesn't happen, and not in a full version or softened version or any version of this law. But were it to pass, our legal partners in the civil society organizations who do legal advocacy are already prepared. And everybody pay attention that sending it to the court is another way to have the Knesset not do what it promised its right-wing voters it would do, and to make sure that they don't have to rule on the most difficult things. The chestnuts in the fire will have to be taken out by the Supreme Court judges. So that's definitely an option.
Great. Shira, thank you so much for sharing with us. And again, more importantly, for all the work you're doing. With that, Jill, I want to come to you. And, before I hand it over, I want to say, I said at the beginning of this, right, I refer to this as the hideous racist bill. It is clearly both of those things. I stand with Benzi and what he said too, that, I'm, and we'll get to this because there are questions in the Q&A about who it applies to. What if it applied to Jews? I would say this, I'm opposed to the death penalty overall in Israel, in the occupied territories, in the United States, or anywhere else. We've heard about the policy, we've heard about the politics. But Jill, I want to ask you, right? Like, this isn't just a legal issue. It's not just a political issue. It's a deep moral question. And how do you think about that? And how do you think we as American Jews should be thinking about that?
Thank you. Well, I want to start off by saying that the death penalty is morally wrong, always, no matter who it applies to. Clearly, in this case, there's also the added racist element, which is also familiar, though not legally in place in the United States. Practically, that is the situation. So I'll talk about that in a second. But I want to talk for a minute about the death penalty in Judaism, which is a huge subject that books and books have been written on. But I'll just say a few words. So the death penalty does exist technically on the books in Jewish law. It comes out of the Torah. One of the very first laws that we get is in Breshit, in Genesis, shofech dam ha'adam ba'adam damo yishafech, that if somebody spills the blood of another person, their blood, the blood of the perpetrator, is also to be spilled. That is capital punishment, because human beings are created b'tselem Elohim. And right there in that very verse, there is a contradiction, because the reason that we take the murder of a person so seriously is because a human being is created B'Tselem Elohim in the image of God. So when a person is killed, it's as if you are killing either a reflection or a somebody who is in some ways an extension or a reflection of God, that you're essentially taking some divinity out of the world. And so the response has to be really serious. It's the worst crime that can be created. But of course, the paradox there is that the response to one person, one Tselem Elohim being removed from the world is now to remove a second one. So now we're down, 2 drops of divinity instead of 1. So there's a paradox there, and the rabbis of the Talmud are very uncomfortable with this, which leads them to put many, many blocks in actually carrying out capital punishment. So yes, it continues to exist, and they spend a lot of time talking about which mode of capital punishment you use in which case, etc. But they also make it so that you effectively can't ever use it. Their standard of evidence is not beyond a reasonable doubt, but actually beyond any possible doubt. And so they say things like, you have to have 2 witnesses, they have to be eyewitnesses, they can't be related to each other or to any of the people involved. They get quizzed separately about all kinds of things. One rabbi famously likes to ask about the figs on the trees, which you might not be paying attention to if you were watching the murder happen. You have to give warning to the person before they commit this murder, this act, that they're going to be liable for capital punishment. So many guardrails that make sure that it basically never can be used. And very famously, there's a line that basically gets quoted all the time, where whenever you're talking about capital punishment, where the Mishnah says, the earliest a layer of the Talmud says that a court that killed one person in 7 years would be considered destructive, and then another rabbi comes in and says 1 in 70 years would be considered destructive, and then a couple other rabbis show up and they say, well, if we were in that court, then we never would have killed anybody, we never would have carried out capital punishment. And I do want to add that the very last line of that conversation, which pretty much never gets quoted in this, is that another rabbi comes along and he says, well, okay, but then you would be increasing the number of murders, right? Like if you never carry out capital punishment, which is our response to murder, then you're just, you've lost any sense of deterrence, and now people are just going to go out and murder. But I do want to say about that, first of all, that last statement doesn't really have an impact on the discussion, but also there's not, in classic Jewish law, there's not prison. There's not other forms of punishment. And so they're dealing in a situation where they feel kind of stuck. They feel like there is capital punishment. They don't want to use it because there's a possibility for misuse. And but there's not another form of punishment. So they end up saying things like, God will work it out. It'll happen. God will carry out the punishment, but we're not going to. But in our situation, we do have other forms of punishment. We have prison. We have other modes of being able to protect society from people who potentially would carry out horrible acts, including murder or terrorism, etc. And the last thing that I want to say, just as one more final piece of Torah, the line that probably, one of the most well-known lines of Mishnah is, anybody who saves one life, it's like they saved a whole world. Anybody who destroys one life, it's like they destroyed a world. It's kind of like a good greeting card kind of thing. You see it up on plaques. But the context of that line is a conversation about how to intimidate witnesses in capital cases. And that's a language that they're using. They want to intimidate the witnesses because they want to make sure that these witnesses are not coming in and just lying. And so they go on to talk about all of the questions that they would ask them. They would say, maybe you heard it from somebody else, maybe, you didn't really see it. And then one of the things they say to them is, you have to know that you're going to be held responsible, not only if this person is actually killed, you're going to be held responsible not only for their death, but also for the deaths of every possible generation that might come from them, and they do a little play on words with the death when Cain kills Abel, that it says that the bloods of your brother, which seems to imply generations of your brother's potential descendants, are now blamed on you. And this is significant because it's significant that one of the most quoted lines that doesn't specifically talk about human beings created in the image of God, but is really clearly implicit there, comes not in a context of talking about your friends or your family or people who it's nice to like, but actually in the situation where somebody has carried out a heinous crime. And that is actually true in many other cases where the rabbis of the Talmud are talking about issues of how to treat somebody in the image of God, how to treat somebody in a way that is respectful, that they tend to do it in cases where it's not a person who you necessarily want to go hang out with on a Saturday night. It might be a person that you're scared of, but those are precisely the situations in which the question of whether we have a society that treats every single person as a creation in the image of God, that's kind of where the rubber hits the road, right? Like, we're not judged on if we're nice to our friends and our family, we're judged on whether we treat with dignity every single person, even the people who maybe should be in prison and kept away from others in society and punished for their crimes, but do we treat them as a creation in the image of God, which includes not killing them? And then the last thing that I do want to say, well, I'll say maybe two more quick things. One is that it's not just me saying this. Every major American denomination, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Reconstructionist, the major denominational organizations have positions on the books opposing the death penalty in the United States, including for some of the reasons that I just said, and also including, because this is the last thing that I want to say, that we've learned a lot about the death penalty in the United States over the last many, many years, including there's a lot of research that shows that it does not work as a mode of deterrence. There's also a lot of research that shows that it is disproportionately used against Black people in particular, people of color in general. And we also know that it is, unfortunately, there are many people who have been executed or on death row who, it turns out, have been innocent of their crimes. About 200 people have been exonerated, I think, since the 70s, since 1973, who were on death row and who were later found out to be innocent. So it is something that's very, very dangerous. And certainly the rabbis of the Talmud were right to be very, very cautious, to the point of making sure that even if it remained on the books, that it couldn't actually be used.
Thank you, Jill. I must say, the quote you were talking about is one I'm familiar with. I think most people are familiar with, and I've never thought about it from the perspective of intimidating witnesses before, even in a good way. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot out of that. The thing I want to ask you, I think, is this, and it's sort of a gigantic question, so apologies, but you and I both spend our time literally and mentally kind of going back between the work in our American Jewish community and our American political space and Israel and the community and the politics there. This bill, I think, is one example of sort of the stark racism that is so prevalent in the moment in Israeli politics. We know that we are dealing with, unfortunately, very similar things here in the US, our own outrageous racists in government, ICE and all of its activities around there. How do you think about those things? How do we, first of all, we kind of make room to engage around all of those? And how do you think about the connection between, not the literal, are the consultants working on both sides, but the connection between the values, morals, lack thereof, that we're seeing, unfortunately, in these predominant roles in both the US and Israel right now?
Thanks. I do want to say, just because when you said it back to me, I realized that intimidating witnesses sounds very bad in English.
I know you meant it as a good.
So I just want to be really clear that the witnesses are only coming for the prosecution, and they're eyewitnesses who are coming for the purpose of getting this person convicted of a capital crime. And that's why you're not intimidating them like like to try to mess with the law. You're trying to make sure that they're not lying.
Yeah,
Okay,
understood.
sorry.
And that's actually why it was eye-opening, because normally when you think of intimidating witnesses, you think of that as a negative, and you're actually talking about, applying like stringent guidelines to the witnesses.
Yeah,
But
sorry. It's something that sounds good in Hebrew and sounds very bad in English.
fair enough.
Okay. But maybe we can study that Mishnah together sometime. It'd be fun. So in terms of our attention, so first of all, it's clear that autocracies and places that are driven by racism across the world are using the same playbook. We're seeing this also in the United States, where capital punishment, the use of capital punishment has dropped. There's very few states that are actually using it. There's President Biden put a freeze on the federal death penalty, but President Trump has been encouraging it with the impact that a number of the states that are more where the leadership is more aligned with him have been increasing their use of capital punishment over the last couple of years, and that is very scary. In terms of where our attention is as American Jews, we are obviously pulled in many different directions, and I can't tell any one person where to put their brain power and their energy, but what I can say is that what's happening in both countries is it's not divorced from each other. Obviously, what happens in Israel also affects us as over here as American Jews. And also would say that, certainly I'll speak very personally for me as a rabbi, as a Jew, somebody who cares deeply about Israel. The decisions that Israel makes, also have moral implications. And I want Israel to reflect the best of what we've learned from our Jewish traditions and Jewish morality. And again, I can't tell anybody whether to go to an ICE protest or write a letter about the death penalty for terrorist bill or give money to an organization in the US or in Israel. I think all of us are dealing with divided attention spans, but I would hope that the fact that our attention is being pulled one way doesn't mean that we think that what's happening in the other place is less important.
Great. Thank you, Jill. And I second that, and I will tell everybody you should do all of those things. So thanks, Jill. I want to bring Benzi and Shira back on screen with us also. We've got questions. I want to remind everybody also, again, if you have questions you want to put into the Q&A, please do so. Now is the moment. So I'm going to pull from some of the things that folks have asked already and consolidate a few of these and really open it up to the three of you, both to answer what I'm about to ask you now, but also if you want to respond to each other a little bit. I know sometimes that kicks things off. So one sort of simple question, which is probably, I assume, Benzi, is a question about East Jerusalem and how the government or how the bill is treating East Jerusalem under this.
Presumably because Israel annexed to East Jerusalem, according to the Israeli law, it counts as within Israel proper. So what we said that applies within Israel proper would apply here. So the death penalty would be an option on the table, and it would apply. It would apply the way it does in Israel, not in the West Bank.
Yeah. So I think the question I'll throw out to you is more about the response overall. I mean, you talked a little bit. Both Benzi and Shira about how hard it has been to get people to speak up against this, both people in the Knesset, but also more broadly. And so I guess my question to you is like, what kind of attention and response is this getting in Israeli public, both, Israeli Jewish and Palestinian? And is there any public outcry against this? What's that looking like? Benzi, Shira.
Yeah, I can take it first. I think it is important to say that, I was saying how hard it was to get the opposition on board, but it's not that you have a huge, massive public or even political support for it either. It's sort of a Ben Gvir passion project that he's been pushing for a long time, and he has the leeway to kind of push it through right now. But you sit in the committee, and it's, there's 2 or 3 Knesset members there from the coalition and from the opposition. They're from Ben Gvir's party. So it's not getting a lot of coverage. I think part of it is just people are swamped and just after 3 years of this stuff and after, and especially after October 7th and the whole war, people are exhausted. They're less tapped in than they were, I think, at the beginning when the judicial coup started. So you're not hearing a lot of it in either direction. I've seen polling in different places saying there's more support, less support, but it's not that there's some kind of massive public support for this thing. It's hard to get people to care, I think, is more what it is. I think there's just exhaustion and an apathy, I think, more than anything.
So I don't disagree with Benzi. I think we're exhausted. We're fighting so many fronts simultaneously, and it's probably part of the way that's going. They're trying to exhaust us. And again, it's ridiculous. They have all the government and majority they need in place. And the fact that we keep standing up for everything we believe in is just amazing success of activists like Benzi and others, of the work that civil society is doing in slowing down these processes, because they're at us just constantly, and it's just wow, it really is exhausting. So kol hakavod us, I'm telling you. But also, I saw a petition, and we get a lot of petitions, okay? It's been petitioning years here. But I saw a petition with thousands of people, including 5 Nobel Prize winners and a number of former Supreme Court judges and former ministers and chief of staff, IDF, and people from the Mossad and people who were chief of police and academics, heads of universities, like the leading figures in Israeli society have signed it and taken an ad, paid for and taken an ad in Haaretz, of course, to say that they stand against this law. And you didn't ask, Hadar, but really listening to Benzi and contemplating and preparing for this meeting and in the prep call we did a while back, just to understand the meaning of this bill, if it's implemented, is really, I'm going to really simplify it, but let's just imagine a situation where there's a commander in the IDF, and it could be any level commander, even very low ranking commander on the ground anywhere in the occupied territories, deciding that someone performed a nationally motivated murder. And of course, anything a Palestinian does in Israel is considered nationally motivated. Any kind of crime is considered nationally motivated. So someone were to decide that a Palestinian conducted a nationally motivated murder, and then a military judge in the military court was to decide, and this is all a closed system, yes, was to decide that this was true and was to rule a mandatory death penalty to be carried out within 90 days with no possibility of clemency, then that's how simple it is. That is how simple it is. Someone was to decide that this is created on a national motivation background, someone to approve that this is how it happens, someone to make the mandatory ruling, and someone to implement it within 90 days. It's like too easy. And I think that's why we all feel that this bill stands against everything we believe in. And to connect to something, last point, to connect to something that Rabbi Jill said, is that I went back and read the Knesset discussions in the first 2 decades of Israel. In the first few years where the death penalty was still in conversation. And I mean, gratefully, all of the years since I'm born, it's been dormant. It's not been implemented. It's not being used. We haven't been talking about it. We haven't been needing it. And we haven't been coming back to it. But when it was in heightened conversation during the first 2 decades of the state of Israel, the people who most opposed this bill in the Knesset, including during the sentencing of Adolf Eichmann, were the religious members of Knesset, including my late grandfather, Dr. Joseph Berg, who was head of the National Religious Party, and who said, us Jews do not sentence a death penalty even on the Nazis. A man who was born in Dresden.
Wow.
And came to Israel and survived the Holocaust and was saved. So, I mean, I feel, an obligation to carry out the message of these members of all of the religious members of the Knessets in the first 2 decades. Not all, but many were against this bill. Why do we have to wake it up? Why do we have to come back to it? Why do we have to use it to cover for our trauma from October 7th and use it to feel strong, or I don't know what, that's what's troubling me the most.
So I want to ask a different thing, but I have to just follow up on that for a second. I mean, that's very powerful. Just the technical question of the religious parties are, of course, mostly in the government coalition right now. There have been a couple of people who have asked about this, especially if the language is softened, so to speak, or changed so to take away the discriminatory element and did include the possibility of death penalty against Jews as well. Do we know if that would change that? Where are the religious parties? Do we think that would change it?
I can say that it's something that we're aware of, and we're very much it's in our back pocket for if that does change. Those arguments are ready to be made, and we're in constant communication with the ultra orthodox parties as well. We know that they're less gung ho about this than like Ben Gvir and Smotrich might be. We're aware of all of that, and we're sort of
but currently they are supporting it, correct?
Currently, that's what they're saying.
Yeah.
They're not against it. We're doing what we can. We're working on it. Yeah.
Different versions of the law, but I know that our organizations on the ground and the partners are strategizing differently with different messaging and different conversations with the different political parties to speak to different messaging, different motivations.
Good.
I will say, I'll add, just historically, or not that far along historically, but Ovadia Yosef, the longtime spiritual leader of Shas, and his son both opposed previous proposals, but they were mostly worried about it being used against Jews, unfortunately.
Yeah. Thanks, Jill. One of the questions that came up, and I want to tweak it a little bit, is, we talked about, Benzi, I think you mentioned that Prime Minister Netanyahu said they can't have a stronger death penalty than the United States. We and Trua and many of our other colleagues signed on to a letter a few weeks ago that we circulated opposing this bill. Certainly, there have been some American Jewish voices speaking up. Has the U.S. ambassador weighed in on this at all? Do you know, or has there been any comment from the U.S. government vis-a-vis this?
I'm not super involved in the diplomatic front. That's a different front. Maybe Shira knows better. I do know that we haven't engaged with the U.S. Embassy as much as we do with other, like we had the Germans come into the committee and voice their objections in person, the German ambassador. The U.S. is not quite as big a player in this, both because of the fact that, again, you guys also have the death penalty, and given the current administration. And
just to be clear, I assume that Ambassador Huckabee would probably support this.
Exactly. So, we're not expecting much from the current administration on that front. So we're focusing, from what I know at least, we're focusing most of our efforts elsewhere with other embassies.
Yeah, same goes for other pieces of legislation. Sorry, same goes for other pieces of legislation in the anti-democratic backsliding process. U.S. currently is not our first go-to.
Yeah. So the follow-up on this, though, is, and I'm going to read it because somebody wrote a good question here. To what degree does this bill, even in its revised form, entrench an unequal legal system over Palestinians in the occupied territories that could accurately be described as legal apartheid? And here's the real question part. Do you think this will shape perceptions of Israel on the world stage? And my addition to that is, does anyone in the government coalition care? Anybody?
Yes.
I can tell you that it's
I know.
Yes, maybe no. Yeah, all right.
Something like that.
Yeah.
I know that the Ministry of Justice, when we were sitting in the committee, brought this up specifically, that like this would be crossing all kinds of international agreements and things that we are signed off on, and it would be putting us at odds with that. And again, the Knesset members the head of the committee is also from Ben Gvir's party. So they just kind of don't really, they've ignored a lot of what the professional, whether it's the Ministry of Justice or whether it's the legal advisor in the committee or foreign affairs as well. There have been a lot of objections, including the Shin Bet also. The Shin Bet sort of changed their position, but they've still said that they're against a mandatory penalty, and right now they're pushing through. So they don't care. Whether or not, Netanyahu cares, clearly we're seeing that he's calling to soften it because he does care. Bibi's sort of happy to let everyone do their thing as long as he stays in power, unless there's enough pressure from somewhere else. So that's where, again, I think the pressure plays a role here, because Bibi's aware of it and he does care, even if Ben-Gvir does not have even the capacity to look that far, and doesn't care even if he could. Yeah, and then I think, again, the other part is that I really don't see the courts, like, maybe Shira can talk about this more, but I don't see, like, we've spent the last 3 years, fighting both in the Knesset and in the streets, getting our butts kicked so that the Supreme Court would remain, and the Supreme Court's still there, and I really don't see a world where they can allow this to pass exactly because of that. Because, again, this is literally changing the wall within the West Bank. That's not, like, at something so dramatic. I don't see it stand. I could be wrong. I don't see it standing.
So we've got a little bit more time. I want to throw one more question kind of out to the three of you. Again, we've focused a lot on the details and the function and of this bill, but I think we're all in agreement that this bill is, a symptom of the broader problems of the challenges to democracy and the racism inherent in this government. I guess the question is, if this does get stopped, do you think that Ben-Gvir, as the primary leader of this, is he likely to keep going forward on this effort, or is it really just one more tool in, his overall political bag, and he'll switch to some different bill, some other way to try to entrench, apartheid and discrimination?
So I think it's part of a big process. And if it's not this, it's another one. And it's not if it's not. There's a lot on their table right now. And I don't think Bibi is interested in this legislation. And also, I'm questioning whether or not he wants to give Ben-Gvir this win before the national elections. Because that's like wonderful tailwinds for Ben-Gvir in his own base. So like all of you said, what's going to determine things more than the international perspective or the moral perspective or the Torah perspective is whether or not it could help or harm Netanyahu's campaign. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And because we're nearing the end, I want to, Hadar, you didn't ask, but I'm going to answer. Sometimes it feels like what we're doing overall, Israelis who believe in peace and who believe in equality, is like being the David to the Goliath of the occupation and of the democratic backsliding, and it's exhausting, like we said, and we're concerned about so many things right now, the situation in Iran and Ramadan. We're in the second day of the Ramadan, and how Ramadan is going to play out on the ground here in Israel. It's very tense. And I want to show you something, because I was in the Jordan Valley today with a visit of NIF board members and staff led by Yehuda Shaul, who many of you might know and appreciate. And we visited the demolished village of a shepherd's community. It's called Maharajat. It's in the Jordan Valley, and walked into the ruined mosque. And these beautiful pieces of, I don't know what it was, like a sign or the wall. I can't even tell. I picked them up from the floor. They're burnt on one side and broken. And I don't know, it's just so difficult for us, and so much more difficult for Palestinians in Israel and in the West Bank. And therefore, all of us, I think, on this call, every single person on this call is just fully committed. And I don't know that I can always promise hope, but I can always promise strategy and commitment, and that's what we keep doing. So thank you.
Thank you, Shira. And Benzi and Jill. Yeah, Benzi, you wanted to add
I can maybe just circle back a little bit to what Shira was saying at the beginning. I think it's important to also separate Ben-Gvir from Netanyahu. I think I agree completely with Shira. Bibi doesn't care about this bill. He needs to just keep his coalition partners, like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, particularly like the little kids that you have to keep occupied and let them play with their toys. And that's what this is for Bibi. For Ben-Gvir, this is his build the wall. This is like what he's been running on since he entered politics. So he's going to push for this as hard as he can. And if he doesn't get it passed, I almost think in a way he might be pushing for this maximalist version of the bill because it's not such a bad outcome for him if it gets thrown out by the Supreme Court afterwards, because then he can run on it again. And then he can run on it even more. I need your votes even more so that I can get rid of the Supreme Court and finally pass the bill. So he's not going to give up on this. But I think, again, he's not really, at the end of the day, the pressure is on Netanyahu, and he is susceptible to that because everything else for Netanyahu is downstream of him staying in control and winning the next election. So, which means that you're someone that you can, he's not an ideological player. The pressure can work.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jill?
I just really want to thank everybody for being on. I know this is not the easiest topic, and for those of us sitting in the US or other countries besides Israel, it might not be top of mind, but it's so important that we're here, that we're saying that we're not going to allow Ben Gvir and the other Kahanas to pass this bill that is just so morally wrong on so many levels. And so that's really important. And I just want to really thank Shira and Benzi and the other Israelis who are there. I am not physically present in the Knesset every day. I'm following the ins and outs of the hearings via WhatsApp that we're all on, and just have so much gratitude for this partnership, and just hope that you all know that there's those of us sitting across the ocean, who are really supporting you and want to make sure that Israel doesn't pass this bill. So thank you.
Absolutely.
You guys, it means a lot.
And, we looked at this in different levels today. So first of all, I just want to add to all three of you and to everyone who joined, my thanks for being with us today, for being in this conversation. And again, most importantly, for being in this work together and being in this community together. This bill is hideous. It is racist. It is terrifying. It's important for us to learn about this and do what we can to fight this. More importantly, because this is only a reflection, is to continue our work and our efforts and our energy together in the fight for democracy, for equality, for freedom. All of us who care about those things, care about them here in the United States and in Israel. We know this is not a sprint. It is a marathon. We've all been in it for different periods of time, and there are those who were in it long before us, and I'm sure there were those who will be in it after us. But I am just personally grateful to be in it with all of you, both our speakers today and everyone on the call. So thank you again. I wish you all farewell. We have recorded this and we'll share it with everyone. So long.
Everyone.
Bye.